Welcome to this module, which is titled The Analogical Imagination in Space and Time. Now, before you tell yourself, I need another cup of coffee to get through this module, let me reassure you. It sounds like a very fancy, presumptuous title for me, The Analogical Imagination in Space and Time. Really what I want to talk about is how the analogical Catholic sacramental imagination serves as the basis for the liturgical year and for church buildings. So the analogical imagination in space and time, I want to give you just the connection between the analogical imagination presented in the previous module and the liturgical year and church buildings. Now, you've already read a lot on the liturgical year from Cardinal Danielou, so I'm not going to rehash any of that really. Instead, let me give you a quote from Rabbi Abraham Heschel as we begin this module. Rabbi Heschel says this: "Man tries to dominate space because he cannot dominate time." Now, that's a very profound sentence. It's a beautiful statement. Man cannot dominate time, so that's why we dominate space. That's why we have these skyscrapers. That's why we build these huge buildings. That's why we have all these football stadiums and convention centers and all of these massive, impressive buildings, because we can dominate space, but we cannot dominate time. So much just in that one sentence. God comes to meet us in time. God comes to meet us really every moment of our lives, but God comes to us perhaps in slightly different ways throughout the different seasons of our life: youth, old age, middle age, wherever you may find yourself right now. Still, you may have a different relationship with God. Maybe the grace of God is operating you slightly differently now in this stage of your life than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago. We dominate space because we cannot dominate time. Magnificent statement from Rabbi Heschel. This is Jewish wisdom here. The Jews never really, built magnificent synagogues. They didn't build huge cathedrals like we do, because their approach to God was through the scriptures, but also through time. And Catholic theology, liturgical theology, borrows a great deal from this Jewish sensibility. This is the basis of our liturgical year, that God comes to meet us through all of the cycles of the seasons, the feasts. And it's not just, again, that we're marking time linearly. We're not really noting anniversaries like this will be the 2016th anniversary of his birth. We don't think of it like that, not linearly, but it's more like a corkscrew. The liturgical year is this deepening of grace that continues every day of our lives, throughout all the years of our lives, that the grace of God comes to us in time, through the seasons, through the cycle of the liturgical year, through the mysteries that we celebrate. Every time we come to Christmas, it's a little different. Every time we come to this celebration, it's a little different. We're a little different. Every time we come to the Easter Vigil, we're a little different than we were last year. God's grace comes to us in time, and we continue to cycle through the great feasts of the liturgical year. And each time we do, we grow in grace and we deepen our faith and our spirituality and our Christian discipleship. Again, I don't want to give you the details of the liturgical year. I don't want to get into all of those specifics, because you've seen a lot of that from the reading assignments already. Let me just give you one that I think is magnificent. Just one instance here of how the analogical imagination works in the liturgical calendar. How about looking at the feast of the birth of John the Baptist? When is that? That's on June 24th. Why June 24th? We don't really know the date when John was born, just like we don't know, or Scripture doesn't say for sure, the date that Christ was born. Why do we celebrate the birth of John the Baptist on June 24th? Well, here's how the analogical imagination sees things. We read in Luke chapter 1, verse 5 to 13, about Zechariah taking his turn as a temple priest in the temple in Jerusalem. It's about the time of the evening sacrifice when incense is being burnt, that the angel comes to him with the news that his wife is going to conceive a son. When was this? We don't know. Could it have been during the Feast of Booths, when the Jews went up to the temple in the fall as commanded to celebrate after the season of the harvest? We don't know, but it's possible that Zechariah was taking his turn during the Jewish Feast of Booths, which is celebrated in the fall, which would have been then a summer birth, the following summer, when his son John would have been born. But still, why June 24th? Again, we don't have the specifics in Scripture, but what we have is the analogical imagination, seeing something really beautiful here. We read in John chapter 3, verse 30, that Jesus must increase and he, John, must decrease. That Christ must increase and that John must decrease. Well, what happens right around June 24th? It's the summer solstice. And after that, the days will start to get shorter. The light will start to decrease incrementally, slowly, day by day. After that date, things start to decrease. The light starts getting shorter and shorter. All of nature is reflecting this decrease as it's moving to Christmas with the birth of Christ, when the light will start to increase again. So all of nature seems to be in harmony with John the Baptist, who says, I must decrease so that he may increase. So it's poetry. It's beautiful. Locating the feast of John the Baptist, the birth of John the Baptist, on June 24th. Now, we don't have the specific date. What we have is the analogical imagination, the poetry that sees this, what's going on in nature all around it, and sees this biblical connection and ponders, maybe that was when John the Baptist was born. Again, don't know for sure, but what I'm presenting to you is how the analogical imagination, the poetic Catholic sensibility that we all share, that's where we get the feast of the birth of John the Baptist. Okay, again, just one example, as I promised, for the liturgical year, since we've done so much of that already in this course. What I'd like to do is show you the analogical imagination at work in, not time now, but space, church building. What I'd like to do in this module is tell you the story of the building of the greatest church in Christendom, the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Now, we know with great exactitude, with great certainty, exactly where St. Peter died and where St. Peter was buried. We know this, we have this, again, validated even out of pagan sources. It says that Peter was crucified in the circus of Caligula and Nero. We have this from Tacitus, who is not a Christian. Now, let me take you there. Let's go to Rome, and let's go to a reconstruction of the ancient circus of Caligula and Nero, often just called the Circus of Nero for short. It's the 1st century AD. There's a brand new stadium in town built by Nero, finished by Nero, started by Caligula, finished by Nero. It was Nero's way of buying people off. He was so unpopular that he had to win people over. So what does he do? He builds this athletic stadium. You can see here the circular nature of the track that would have been perfect for chariot races. And this was for people's entertainment. This was for sport and for spectacle. So there were chariot races around the corner. There are other contests there. But notice in the very center of the circular track, there's an obelisk. This statue, or this obelisk, this stone structure, pointing straight up, right on the center spine of the track. So this would have been a focal point that would have, focused people's attention right there in the center. Tacitus tells us that Peter was crucified right here, right next to the obelisk that was in the circus of Nero. Peter was killed for sport. Peter was killed basically during halftime. So there's an athletic contest here, there's a chariot race here, and again, to show just how much hatred the Romans, especially the emperor, had for Christianity and for Peter in particular. Peter is crucified, executed publicly right next to this obelisk. Again, for sport, for cruel entertainment. Peter's killed here, and then his body is just thrown outside of the circus. Now, if you look at this map of Rome, you can see that the circus of Nero was outside the ancient city. It was across the Tiber, it was across the river, so it was on the outskirts of the city, and they put cemeteries out here because, again, according to Roman custom, no one could be buried inside the city. That's why there are catacombs outside the ancient city walls of Rome. No one could be buried within the city. The dead had to be taken outside the city walls, outside the city limits, and buried there. So here we have this brand new stadium built by Nero. It's outside of the city, it's across the Tiber River, and so there are cemeteries that are burial plots that are just put outside the cemetery because, again, they're outside the city limits. Peter's body was just dumped here. They put as little effort into a proper burial as they could. They just tossed his body right outside the Circus of Nero and buried him there. All the Christians that remained, of course, knew exactly where the body was. Peter is executed 64 AD, maybe as late as 66 AD. Different historians have different theories about that. But within 100 years, there is a monument erected over his grave. It's called the Trophy of Peter. And so right over his grave would have been built this very simple monument, this very simple, graveside monument to mark the grave and to honor Peter. Now, it's 160 AD. Christianity is still far from legal. There are still waves of persecution, but no one would have noticed this. This was just one cemetery plot among many others. This was just one monument among many others. So it was standing in plain sight, and the Roman pagans would have paid no notice of this. It was just, again, a very ordinary looking cemetery monument, graveside monument, but of course all the Christians came here with great devotion. And they've even found graffiti next to this. So graffiti would have been written on the sides, again, would have escaped notice. No one would have really paid it much attention. It's just one grave among many others. This is built in the year 160 AD. Fast forward a couple hundred years, it's now 313 AD, and Constantine legalizes Christianity, and he is very sympathetic to Christianity, and he will ultimately be baptized on his deathbed as a Christian. He's not yet a Christian, but he is an emperor who believes that Christ helped him become emperor and helped him win his military battles. So Constantine wants to build a basilica over the trophy of St. Peter. He wants to build a basilica, a magnificent church over the grave of St. Peter. And this is how he does it. As you can see here, the original grave was on a slope, and you can see the trophy there on the graveside there. It would have just been on the side of a hill, and so this was far from an ideal place in which to build a big church. So what Constantine does is he pulls the whole hillside down. He brings all of the dirt above, and he levels it. And so he just encompasses all of the area around the trophy, around the grave itself, and he pulls all this dirt down, and he builds a level foundation. And so underneath all of this is perfectly preserved early 4th century Rome. It's about the year 320 AD when Constantine does this. So he pulls all this dirt down in order to create this firm, flat, level foundation, and that's what he decides to build St. Peter's Basilica on. Now, when you come with me to Rome, you can go down here. We can go down here. They have excavated all of this, and so not just the trophy of Peter, but all of the cemetery monuments. That really, it's a street that was just preserved perfectly here. You can walk the street, and you can walk underneath St. Peter's Basilica, and you take what's called the Scavi tour. That's underneath St. Peter's, and you can go. It's all been perfectly excavated, and you can walk the streets. The place exactly where Peter was buried. In fact, you can do this right now. You don't have to wait until the road trip, or if you're not able to go with us, you can actually take that tour now. Here's a link, and if you click on this, you will be able to take a virtual tour underneath St. Peter's. You can go through the Scavi on this virtual tour, and it will take you to the trophy, and you can see part of the trophy wall on this link that the Vatican has provided. So if you'd like to do that now, you can, or if you want to wait until after this module, you can go back and do this. But here's a link to the Scavi tour that will take you underneath the Basilica of St. Peter's right up to the grave of the Apostle Peter himself. Okay, if you want to do that now, feel free. We're back up above ground now, and what I've done is, in this picture, I've shown you how the current St. Peter's Basilica is in relationship to the Circus of Nero. So you can see here on this graph, the obelisk. Note the obelisk there in the middle. It's in the middle of that circular part of the Circus of Nero. The obelisk, that's exactly where Peter died. It's right near the obelisk that Peter died. So then look over towards the top of this, and you can see where the center of St. Peter's Basilica is built over the grave of Peter. So we have the spot where he was executed at the obelisk, and then notice it's just right outside the Circus of Nero. It's just, again, they couldn't have hardly been bothered to provide Peter a decent burial. They literally throw his body just outside the circus, and there it is buried right next to the circus. And it's right on top of this that the entire structure of St. Peter's Basilica is built. In fact, if you look at this view of St. Peter's, you have the cross up on top, and then you had this magnificent dome of St. Peter's, started by Michelangelo. He doesn't live to see it finished, but he certainly lives to see the drum of it go up. So you have this dome. This dome is on top of the grave itself. It signals it's centered over the top of the grave of St. Peter's. Then if you go inside, you see this magnificent baldacchino and this altar. This too is right under the dome, and it's right on top of the grave of St. Peter. It's right on top of the trophy. Now it's down several layers, it's several meters lower underneath the altar, but everything here has been stacked right on top of the grave itself. So the grave, the trophy, the altar, the baldacchino, the dome, the cross on top, it's all built right on top of the grave of the Apostle Peter. You can see the location here in this picture. Here's a different picture that shows, again, just an outline where the Circus of Nero was. Now, of course, that's long been destroyed, but down underneath St. Peter's, you can still see the foundations of the Circus of Nero. And then notice over where the dome is. Again, the top of the cross, the dome, all of that is built right over the location of the grave of the Apostle Peter. What I'd like to do now is this is such a great story that I just have to tell you. Let's look at this image of St. Peter's. Now, this is the current basilica, obviously. This is really the second St. Peter's. This is not the basilica Constantine built, but instead, well, let me do this. Let me show you. This is the basilica Constantine built. So in the year 320 AD, he starts this, and it's this massive, sprawling complex, and the whole church is built right on top of the grave. So if you look at the top of the cross, the T up there, that is where the grave of Peter was. Now notice over here, you can see where the obelisk is. See where that arrow is pointing to the obelisk? So Constantine tore the circus of Nero down. They tore the circus down, again, to make room for his basilica, but they left the obelisk standing there because that's the spot where Peter died. And then notice how close the church is to the spot. So they tear the circus down and they build this church, and then they build it right over the grave of Peter. Now this first Constantinian basilica, it stands for almost 1,200 years. And it's in the late 1400s that they notice it's falling down. It's in need of it's in great disrepair. And they had the idea, the popes do, of building a new St. Peter's. So they tear the old Basilica of Constantine down and they build the new St. Peter's. Now notice in this view here we see the current St. Peter's, the new St. Peter's. Notice where the obelisk is now. It's right in the center of the piazza. Now, it used to be standing over here. I'll circle this area here. This is where the obelisk was, and notice how far they had to move it to make sense to set off the new piazza that they were planning. Moving an obelisk that big, that far, was a stupendous feat of Renaissance engineering. The obelisk is, 60 feet tall. It weighs hundreds of tons. It's solid stone. The idea of even just trying to move something that big back then was intimidating enough, but then to actually do it, they were so worried that the thing would crack, that the thing would just crumble if they tried to move it. But the engineers convinced the Pope that it could be done. And so what they decided to do is they built all of these wooden structures to just lay the obelisk down on its side and then roll it over to this new spot. And then using all of these hoists and wooden structures, they were going to then raise the obelisk back up in this new position. Sounds easy, but it's anything but. So on the day, this is the way the story goes, on the day in which this was going to be done, the Pope ordered absolute silence under pain of excommunication. No one was to speak during this entire process. They were that nervous, that scared about ruining this obelisk. And so the day in which they do this, they take the obelisk down, no problem. They roll it over to the spot where it's supposed to, now sit. And as they start to raise the obelisk up, the ropes start to break. The ropes start snapping, and they're in danger of having the obelisk topple over, and if it topples over on its side, it's ruined, it's crushed. Who knows if they're ever able to get it back upright. So the ropes are cracking, everybody is starting to freak out. It looks like all hope is lost when one of the men working on this project had been a sailor. And he knew from his years of sailing that if you throw water on the ropes, it makes them stronger. And it makes them, gives them a tensile strength that they don't have when they're dry. So this one guy yells out, "Throw water on the ropes." Now that's a violation of the Pope's explicit commandment. But they do it. They do it. They throw the water on the ropes. It works. The ropes hold, and they're able to get the obelisk standing straight up, in place, all is well. That guy saved the day. Now, he did violate the explicit commandment of the Pope, but since it worked, the Pope wasn't upset at all. In fact, he was grateful. And the man is rewarded. He's given, a great financial reward, but he's also given this rather, special award. His family was given the right to provide the palms for Palm Sunday every year. So to this day, if you go to Palm Sunday Mass at St. Peter's, everybody gets these palms that are distributed in the piazza. Well, it's the same family that has the honor of providing the palms for every Palm Sunday. So again, it's a magnificent story it's. I just thought I had to tell it to you. It's so good. Okay, you can tell from all that it was an enormous undertaking just to move the obelisk, let alone to build the basilica. It took 120 years to tear down the old St. Peter's and to build the new St. Peter's. And the greatest artists of all time, including Michelangelo, Leonardo, Raphael, Bernini, all of these people worked on the current St. Peter's. And it is just a spectacular example of the analogical imagination at work. Why go through all of this? Why do all of this? Not just the obelisk, but the whole thing. The interior of St. Peter's is just stupendous. Why do all of this? Well, the analogical imagination. Catholics see their churches as sacred places, as places worthy of God to visit on earth, as reflections of heaven, as sacred places. Catholics see every church, even ones that can't touch St. Peter's. Every church is a sacred place. Now, there's no guarantee that just by walking in St. Peter's that a person will be struck to personal conversion. There's no guarantee of grace even necessarily. Millions of tourists walk through St. Peter's. God can work and inspire people through St. Peter's, but God can also work in the plainest auditorium as well. Here's what Andrew Greeley says. St. Peter's, the Basilica, magnificent as it is, it's no guarantee of the grace of God. St. Peter's and other magnificent Catholic churches, they depict God and the glory of God and the beauty of God, but God can also work through the plainest of auditoriums. But St. Peter's and other magnificent Catholic churches, they do echo with distinctly enchanted and enchanting voices. And that is the analogical imagination in spades. Okay, we've been spending a lot of time with these tongue twisters, the analogical and dialectical imagination. I'd like to make just one major point with the rest of the time that I have left in this module. And I hope that it continues to reinforce and explain these two different ways of looking at God and the world, the analogical and the dialectical. And the last thing I'd like to consider is, where does anti-Catholicism come from? Why does it hang around? Now, it's a lot better today than it has been, to be sure, but it's still out there. Where does this anti-Catholicism in this country, where does it come from, and why is it still there? It's been called the last acceptable American prejudice, and even though things are better today, it never really goes away. It still pops up from time to time. I think that understanding the analogical and the dialectical imaginations, respectively, will help you see where anti-Catholicism comes from and why it hangs around and why it never really goes away in this country. Okay, it's obvious America is not a Catholic country, and you could even argue whether it's a Christian country anymore, given what's going on in this world of ours today, but it's definitely been shaped by Christianity, but by Protestant Christianity. America has been shaped by the dialectical imagination. The vestiges of Protestant thought are still very much embedded in the culture here. Even though perhaps America, again, you could argue whether it's how much of a Christian nation it remains, still it's culturally Protestant, and the majority is very much shaped by the dialectical approach to things, the dialectical imagination of Protestantism. And basically, because of this, because there are two different ways of looking at things, two different ways of looking at God, two different ways of looking at the world that I've been trying to explain in this and the previous couple modules, Protestants look at Catholics as different. There's a reason for this, and I think this explains it. The dialectical approach, the analogical approach, they look at God and the world and the church and the individual differently. And so deep down, Protestants have just suspected that Catholics are different from them, and they're right. We are. Not better, not worse. As people, we are not better, certainly not worse. But the reason why Protestants deep down sense that Catholics look at things differently is because we do. And the analogical imagination that fuels Catholic thought is different, sees things differently than does the dialectical imagination that drives Protestant thinking. Now, we're not as different as we used to be. Mass is no longer in Latin. Catholics have become very mainstream in this country. JFK broke the ice as far as a Catholic holding the office of the president. Rick Santorum, a Catholic, won the evangelical vote in the Iowa caucuses back in 2008. So Catholics have arrived in terms of politics here. The majority of the Supreme Court are Catholics. And so in many ways, as Catholics, we've arrived. We're just as affluent, we're just as integrated, we're just a part of American society as Protestants are, but still deep down there's this sense that Catholics are somehow different than the Protestant majority of this country. We're going to read a really interesting article after you finish watching this module, and it's going to go into a lot of historical differences, a lot of explanations for where anti-Catholicism came from and why it's still here. And it will conclude with some of the points that I'm trying to make here in terms of the analogical imagination is the reason why Protestants think that Catholics are different. But let me give just a couple of examples as well to highlight this differentness. When I started teaching, my very first assignment was in Pittsburgh, Kansas, and Our Lady of Lourdes is the parish there, and the grade school has been there for over 100 years now. They tore the old one down and they built a new one, but when I was still there, this makes me sound really old, but when I was still there, the old first grade school, built 100 years ago, was what was there. And over the front door of the original grade school was this stone carving up over the front doors that said St. Mary's Public Grade School. St. Mary's Public School. Now that's odd. It's never been a public school. It's always been a Catholic school. But why did they put the sign up there in stone, engrave it in stone, St. Mary's Public School? Well, it's because of the Ku Klux Klan. Back when the grade school was first built, the Ku Klux Klan was quite active. Pittsburgh is very close to the border with Arkansas and northeastern Oklahoma, and the Klan was very active down there. And so out of concern for the Klan, the grade school never said St. Mary's Catholic School. It said St. Mary's Public School to mollify the concerns about the active Ku Klux Klan that was notoriously anti-Catholic, as well as, of course, primarily anti-African American. The Ku Klux Klan was this nativist group. It was out of this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant American mentality. The Ku Klux Klan was an extreme and a deviant example of the dialectical thinking. It shows you when the dialectical thinking just goes too far in one extreme and has no connection with the analogical imagination. It can end up in some just rather prejudicial, even horrific positions. Now, the Catholic imagination, when it goes astray, it can end up in superstition. And so voodoo down in the Caribbean, it's quite at home mixing Catholic symbols and Catholic imagery, and voodoo is obviously a very aberrant and deviant example of the Catholic imagination. So the point I've been trying to make is both viewpoints need each other. Both viewpoints can go off in the wrong direction if they're too far separated from each other. Both viewpoints can complement and help each other. So I don't want you to think that one is, better than the other. They both can help each other and complement each other and reinforce each other. But in order to really explain the difference, I need to make this distinction between them. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm showing you how different The dialectical imagination is from Catholic thinking, and it's the reason for the lingering anti-Catholicism here. When it's separated from the analogical imagination, when Protestants don't know any Catholics, and the same can be said on the flip side, they start to suspect and have prejudices, and then you're off to the races. But the reason why Catholicism is still suspect in some quarters of this country is because of the dialectical imagination that is too insulated from any context with Catholicism. Okay, I mean, just look at the article is going to give several historical examples of this. We've all, I think, are old enough, most of us, to remember John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, the first Catholic to become president, obviously, and what he had to fight against in order to win that election. And what a watershed moment it was for Catholics in this country. Now, some people wish that maybe he hadn't won, because what JFK had to do to get elected, he had to go down to Dallas. He had to meet with all these Baptist pastors, and he had to promise them that he would not take orders from the Pope, which is ludicrous, of course. But also he made the statement, "I will not let my religion guide any of my decision-making." JFK had to promise that to win the Baptist pastors over and to win election. Now, this set a horrible precedent in our country, frankly. How many Catholics since then, especially with respect to the abortion issue, how many times have we heard a Catholic say, "Well, I'm personally opposed to it, but I'm not going to let my religion influence any of my decision-making"? It started with JFK. The promise JFK had to make to the Baptist pastors, again, it's gone off the rails now in terms of with the abortion question. And it seemed like a reasonable thing to the Baptists back then, who were, meeting with JFK. But the point I'm making is, why did he have to do this to begin with? Because deep down in the cultural DNA of this country, Catholics were always perceived to be different, and especially to the Protestant majority. And we have been. We are different. We see things differently. Again, not better or worse in terms of people, but Catholics look at things differently than do Protestants. And because of this, Catholics are perceived as other, as different, as somehow not quite as American as, the WASP establishment. Now again, we've come a long way with this. In terms of politics, I think a lot of this has been overcome. We have a Catholic vice president now, Joe Biden, and again, we have majority member of the Supreme Court are Catholics. But still, anti-Catholicism pops up all the time. I've mentioned, or I've showed to you those Jack Chick comics before that are notoriously anti-Catholic. Now those comics pick on lots of other religions. They're anti-Mormon, they are anti-Jewish, they are anti a lot of people, really. So it's not just Catholics who are the target of the Jack Chick comments. But the anti-Catholicism is noticeable and rears up on a regular basis, mainly out of Hollywood, it seems to me, and on TV. Just this year, there's this horrible new show called You, Me, and the Apocalypse, in which Rob Lowe is a priest, and he is supposed to be the devil's advocate, even though that position's been eliminated in the Catholic Church. The devil's advocate used to be part of the process of canonization, and the devil's advocate would try to, really it's an attempt at due diligence, try to point out all the weaknesses of the person being considered for canonization so that the Church would completely evaluate the person who was being proposed for canonization and make sure that the Church did the right thing. Well, not on this movie, in this TV show. In this TV show, it's a horrible character, and it's a really anti-Catholic show. I watched the first episode. I will not watch any more of it. I was really disappointed in NBC and shocked, but I guess not surprised at the anti-Catholicism in this TV show. It keeps popping up. Now, again, why the anti-Catholicism. Some people think that's because of the positions that the Catholic Church takes on abortion, on homosexuality, on same-sex marriage, and because the church is so big and so prominent and speaks so clearly and authoritatively, some people think it's because of the stances that the Catholic Church takes, that this is the reason for the anti-Catholicism in Hollywood in particular. And that's part of it. I'm not saying that that's not true, but I think it goes deeper than that. And it goes into this difference that I'm trying to articulate between the analogical and the dialectical imagination. Remember, the dialectical imagination is all concerned about the rights of the individual, that the individual is what matters. Remember, the dialectical approach sees God as absent from the world, and so God is not present in the world, God is not present in the community. Instead, for the dialectical approach, God is present in the individual, and the individual is paramount. And what the individual determines is what matters, and so individual freedom is what matters in the dialectical approach. So anything that is perceived to threaten that is the enemy. And again, non-Christians, just secularists today, that are still influenced by the cultural DNA of the United States, where individual rights are paramount. They see the Catholic Church as threatening those individual rights, and so for this reason, they will oppose the church and they will bash the church, and anti-Catholicism is still alive and well in this country, and there are, the examples are easy to find, mostly, I think, out of Hollywood and on TV shows. I did not see the movie Dogma because I did not want to give my money to that. So I have to say I haven't seen that movie, but from the previews it looked like an assault on Catholicism in particular and just religion in general. Although again, I have to admit that I haven't seen that. I did watch that TV show because I wasn't giving them any money of mine, but I won't again watch that show, You, Me, and the Apocalypse. Okay, again, what drives a lot of anti-Catholicism is sort of the remains, the cultural remains of Protestantism that shaped this country, and the dialectical imagination that just exalts the role of the individual. That the individual is the one that matters, that the individual gets to decide what's right and wrong. This comes again from the Protestant approach. Again, really where we are today in this secular environment, it's an unintended consequence of the Protestant Reformation. The Protestant Reformation never intended for this to happen, what we have around us today. The Protestant Reformation never intended secularism. Again, there were many abuses in the church. There were many problems that needed to be corrected. And so the Protestant Reformation turns away from the role of the community and just exalts the individual. But this is where we've ended up. Now it's the individual only that matters in this country in particular. And I think this deep-seated philosophy, or let's call it approach or viewpoint, the dialectical imagination, is the reason why we never seem to get anywhere with the